So what did Putin mean when he said that? Now, you might have heard about his Valdai speech, and you might be curious about what ideas and what sort of thinkers inform Vladimir Putin's strategies in the world. You might have heard of Alexander Dugin or Putin's playbook. But I'm going to try to show you in this video some of the real cultural references that Vladimir Putin uses when he articulates his idea of Russian civilization and the multipolar world. And again, my aim in this video isn't to advocate or agree with what Vladimir Putin is saying, but simply to try to understand him better, because if we can understand him better, we will understand a very significant body of thought and ideas that are shaping the world today. So let's get straight into it. I've got 7 key cultural references that Vladimir Putin made in his major speech to the Valdai Discussion Club in October 2022. In the video with the link below, I outlined what Vladimir Putin presented in this speech, and it was a surprisingly open and pragmatic call for different cultures to live and let live in the multipolar world. But it also contained a large number of references to Russian thinkers, some well known and some less so. Some that I almost immediately understood. Some I actually had to do quite a bit of research to really understand what the point of the reference was and what it tended to reveal about geopolitical thinking today. But I think it's certainly, if you do look into these references, it shows you something interesting about Putin's mind and the Russian culture and how it's shaping its orientation in the world today. So let's go through these 7 allusions or references. And first of all is Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Now, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who you can see on screen there, is referenced in Vladimir Putin's speech in this way. He says, "I would like to quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn's famous Harvard commencement address delivered in 1978. He said that typical of the West is a continuous blindness of superiority, and it continues to this day, which upholds the belief that vast regions everywhere on our planet should develop and mature to the level of present-day Western systems." So Alexander Solzhenitsyn is, I guess, reasonably well known, maybe perhaps not so well known now as in the 1970s and 1980s. But certainly he's been given a little bit more prominence recently by Jordan Peterson, frequently commenting on his writings. And he was, I guess, a dissident writer who wrote about the experience of the Gulag in Russia, in the Soviet Union, I should say. So, for example, he wrote the Gulag Archipelago, which is accounts partly fictional, partly real, of life in the Gulag. And he also wrote One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which, if you haven't read it, is a great read. It's about 140 pages, so it's really quite a short read, and it's actually an account of his Solzhenitsyn's life as a Gulag prisoner, the Gulag being the large Soviet prison camp, work camps And Solzhenitsyn won the Nobel Prize, I think in 1971 or so, maybe the late 1960s. And he was a trenchant critic of the Soviet Union, but from a Orthodox Christian point of view, a quite conservative traditionalist point of view, and in a way a Slavophile point of view as well, celebrating the culture of Russia and the Slavs as distinct from that from the West, and shaped very much by the history of Orthodox Christianity and its involvement in Eurasia. And in 1978, he gave a famous address titled "A World Split Apart" at Harvard. And the American audience were perhaps expecting some backslapping and mutual admiration, because at this point, Solzhenitsyn was an exile. He'd been exiled, expelled from the Soviet Union. And it took a number of years for him to actually claim his Nobel Prize, because he wasn't initially allowed to travel out of the Soviet Union, but ultimately he was. So he came to Harvard and gave this address. So I'll just run the video in the background while I explain what Solzhenitsyn said, and you might be able to see some of the subtitles there. So, and this is the quote where that Vladimir Putin quotes from in full. "But the persisting blindness of superiority continues to hold the belief that all the vast regions of our planet should develop and mature to the level of contemporary Western systems, the best in theory and the most attractive in practice, that all those other worlds are but temporarily prevented by wicked leaders or by severe crises or by their own barbarity and incomprehension from pursuing Western pluralistic democracy and adopting the Western way of life. Countries are judged on the merit of their progress in that direction, but in fact such a conception is a fruit of Western incomprehension of the essence of other worlds, a result of mistakenly measuring them all with a Western yardstick. The real picture of our planet's development bears little resemblance to all this." So the idea is quite similar to what is outlined in Vladimir Putin's speech. And I think Putin would have actually met Solzhenitsyn maybe even in the early years of his presidency. In the speech, Solzhenitsyn also spoke of a decline in courage in the West. He said, "Political and intellectual functionaries exhibit this depression, passivity and perplexity in their actions and in their statements, and even more so in their self-serving rationales as to how realistic, reasonable and intellectually and even morally justified it is to base state policies on weakness and cowardice." He was a trenchant critic of the claimed power of the press in the West. And it's really quite an amazing speech that's well worth checking out. You can get it quite easily on the web, either from the Solzhenitsyn Center, and I'll put in a link below, or via YouTube. And the speech, in a way, really precedes Putin's call for a multipolar world, and Putin echoes to some degree, much less strongly, but certainly to some degree, Solzhenitsyn's call to root that multipolar world in traditional spiritual values from different parts of the world. So nearly 50 years before Vladimir Putin's speech, there is a major speech by a Russian intellectual celebrated in the West that castigates the West for its intellectual, cultural and moral decline. And it's not insignificant that Putin should refer to this speech. Okay, let's go to the second cultural reference, and it's one of Solzhenitsyn's, a great Russian novelist's forebears, perhaps one of the greatest Russian novelists, Fyodor Dostoevsky, who is quoted. So Putin is talking about, I guess, cancel culture, but also more broadly the, near totalitarian impulse that there is sometimes within liberal rationalist thought. And this is what Putin says. Dostoevsky prophetically foretold all this back in the 19th century. One of the characters of his novel Demons, the nihilist Shigalov, described the bright future he imagined in the following way. Emerging from boundless freedom, I conclude with boundless despotism. This is what our Western opponents have come to. Another character of the novel, Pyotr Bekobensky, echoes him, talking about the need for universal treason, reporting and spying, and claiming that society does not need talents or greater abilities. Cicero's tongue is cut out, Copernicus has his eyes gouged out, and Shakespeare is stoned. This is what our Western opponents are arriving at. What is this if not Western cancel culture? And Dostoevsky's great novel, variously translated from the Russian Yezdi as the devils or the possessed, is a wonderful novel, great novel. It's a real condemnation of nihilism and that Solzhenitsyn was a political prisoner in a way. He was sent to the Gulag and was then subsequently exiled from Russia. Dostoevsky himself was a political prisoner in a way, and sent into internal exile in Siberia for a number of years. And funnily enough, for a man who is reputed to be a dictator, this seems to be a common theme in the idea or the figures quoted in quite a few of Vladimir Putin's speeches. Let's turn to the third major reference, and that is to a man known as Alexandr Zinoviev. Okay, so in his speech, Vladimir Putin says Alexandr Zinoviev, whose birth centenary we will celebrate on October 29, more than 20 years ago he said that Western civilization needed the entire planet as a medium of existence and all the raw resources of humanity to survive at the level it had reached. Who is Alexandr Zinoviev? Now, I have to confess, I did not know this before doing the research for this video, but Zinoviev turns out to be quite an intriguing figure, and again with some common characteristics. He is another Russian critic of the West, but not just of the West. He was a Soviet-Russian philosopher born in 1922, and writer, thinker, and sociologist. Towards the end of his life, he also criticised globalisation, but he began, if you like, by criticising Soviet, post-Soviet, and then Western societies in turn. Some say his views were marked by tragedy and pessimism. He wrote a quite famous book called Yawning Heights in, I think, the early 1970s, which was a bit of a satire on Soviet reality. And this led to his expulsion from the Communist Party and his designation as an anti-Soviet dissident. In the 1980s and 1990s, he sort of went into European exile and was a prolific writer and representative of Soviet dissident emigres. But he found his life increasingly lonely and unsatisfying. He turned to a more sympathetic reading of the popular collectivism of the Soviet era. And he became a very fierce critic of Mikhail Gorbachev and especially of Boris Yeltsin and what happened in Russia in the 1990s, glasnost and perestroika. Perestroika was Gorbachev's term for the rebuilding of society and the economy in a more open system. But it became hijacked by Western economic advisors and Boris Yeltsin's, well, let's call a spade, corruption. And Zinoviev became a fierce critic of this. He, in fact, described perestroika as katastroika, as in catastrophe, and argued it was a revolution from above that did not deal with the underlying realities of post-Soviet society. And he criticised the sort of naive Russian liberals who idealised the West. He even went so far as to speak with some admiration of aspects of Stalin's political career, but he certainly described the new Russian regime under Boris Yeltsin as a colonial democracy. He returned to Russia in June 1999, the same year Vladimir Putin became president, and was heavily influenced by the bombing of Yugoslavia by NATO. Yes, that defensive alliance, NATO, which bombed Yugoslavia in 1999, quite ruthlessly so. And this had, one should understand, a profound shock throughout the Russian Orthodox East European world. Even a historian like Felipe Fernandez Amesto often refers to the betrayal of the West's own ideals in the bombing of Yugoslavia. And this was one of the reasons Zinoviev returned to Russia and became increasingly critical of Russia's surrender to the West and of Europe's surrender to America and globalization. He was hopeful that Putin would change, but by the end of Zinoviev's life in 2006, tragic, pessimistic thinker that he was, he saw little hope in Putin. He felt Putin was only legitimising the consequences of the Yeltsin coup and its catastrophic privatisation and nationalisation. Perhaps in the years since 2006, Vladimir Putin has stepped further and further away from those years of oligarch, kleptocratic democracy in Russia in the 1990s and developed a different idea of the Russian state. And Zinoviev developed a theory of a post-democratic West, which had all sorts of interesting terms like Westernoids and whatnot, but effectively was saying there was developing a form of social organisation that began in Europe, spread to North America, and has come to Australia, where capitalism and democracy work well for some, but are incredibly destructive for many, and that beneath the rhetoric of democracy, there is a totalitarian and instinct to this kind of liberalism, and it's based on a rigid discipline. Westernism is evolving from democracy and capitalism towards a post-democratic communality. It's quite an intriguing idea. Intriguing but very dark idea, the concept of a sort of a super society where hierarchical power networks of the superstate engage in strategic management, controlled finance, media manipulation, oligarchic parties, and money totalitarianism of various kinds. Like Solzhenitsyn, like Dostoevsky, Zinoviev was also punished for his heterodox thoughts. Both, I guess, his exile from Russia, but also the difficulty and the pain he experienced in finding a sort of home. But again, you can see the resonance of these ideas of that are also presumably, to some degree, shaping Putin's own thinking about the nature of Western society, some of the processes underway in Western society, and why in the Valdai speech he does refer to the different aspects of the West and the division between the elites of the West and the broader populace, the broader population, the citizenry, and its own cultural traditions. Okay, so so that's Alexandr Zinoviev, and I should note two things. One, that a couple of days after Putin's appearance at the Valdai conference, he actually spoke at the 100th anniversary of Zinoviev's death, so commemorating that, and spoke about his significant contribution of thinking. And also there is a video of Alexandr Zinoviev going toe-to-toe with Boris Yeltsin about Gorbachev, perestroika, and the new Russia in 1990, which I'll include a link to below. Okay, so our fourth cultural reference from Vladimir Putin relates to the cultural diversity of Russian tradition. Now, Putin is often presented as presenting in the West an idea of orthodox, traditional, nationalist, Russian ethnic nationalism. But let's listen to what he says here. Over 1,000 years, Russia has developed a unique culture of interaction between all world religions. There is no need to cancel anything, be it Christian values, Islamic values, or Jewish values. we have other world religions as well. All you need to do is respect each other. In a number of our regions, I just know this firsthand, people celebrate Christian, Islamic, Buddhist and Jewish holidays together, and they enjoy doing so as they congratulate each other and are happy for each other. So it's a fairly banal comment in a way, but it does reinforce an important thing, which is that, yes, Russia does have this tradition of a multi-faith, multinational empire. Empire in a neutral sense of the word, as a state that can provide a home to many different cultural identities. And so it's a bit of a challenge to the presentation of Russia as an exclusively orthodox civilization, as, for example, is presented in the work of Samuel Huntington in Clash of Civilizations, that I'll return to in a moment. Although this may be less well known in the West, it's a very strong feature of Russian self-identity and a common aspect of Putin's rhetoric, even around the Ukrainian war. It's actually a contrast to the sort of ethno nationalism you're getting out of Ukraine with the Azov Battalion and all that sort of thing. And, you know, Ukraine's been around since, you know, the 5th century BC, all this sort of thing. Rather, he emphasises the sort of sense in which the Russian state has developed a way in which multiple nationalities can actually multiple nationalities, religions, cultural traditions can kind of work together. The fifth reference is to a Russian writer, philosopher of the 19th century, Nikolai Danilevsky. And what Putin says is this. He says the great Russian philosopher Nikolai Danilevsky, he believed that progress did not consist of everyone going in the same direction as some of our opponents seem to want. This would only result in progress coming to a halt. Danilevsky said, progress lies in, quote, walking the field that represents humanity's historical activity, walking in all directions, he said, adding that no civilization can take pride in being the height of development. So Nikolai Yakovlevich Danilevsky lived between 1822, so another centenary coming up. Maybe some of these people were chosen because of centenary type bicentenary type moments. Between 1822 and 1885, and he was a Russian naturalist, economist, ethnologist, philosopher, historian, administrator, in a way, bureaucrat, if you like, an ideologue of the Pan-Slavism and Slavophile movement. He gained some notoriety for criticising Charles Darwin's theory of evolution from a kind of a religious point of view, not alone there in the mid-19th century. But more significantly for the reference in Putin's speech, he developed a theory of historical cultural types, which asserted that there were a set of historical types related to ethnicity, culture, language, nationality, and he also articulated a circular view of history. These cultures sort of, go through a life cycle, and things sort of the eternal circle of life has its way. And concluded in a vision of the unification and development of the Slavic world. Curiously enough, he studied fisheries and water supply in the Black Sea, and other coastal regions of Russia. He even headed up a commission on the use of running water in Crimea from 1872 to 1879. Of course, one of the first things Russia did when it invaded Ukraine was to bomb the obstacles that Ukraine had placed on the water and canals running into Crimea. That's right, the Ukrainian government under Zelensky and co. had actually blocked the flow of fresh water into Crimea. So maybe there's a reference there. And he died in Tiflis and was buried at his estate on the Crimean coast. Again, he was arrested for membership of a circle that was studying French socialist writings in the 1840s, somewhat like Dostoevsky, another political dissident. His theory of historical cultural types appeared in 1869 in a work, Russia and Europe, a look at the cultural and political relations of the Slavic world to the Romano-German world. The theory compared cultures and nations to biological species, united by language and culture, but unable to cross over between themselves. And for that reason, he argued that the Europeanization of the Slavic world was doomed to fail. He distinguished 4 categories of historical cultural activity: religious, political, socio-political, and cultural. And these gave rise to 10 historical cultural types: Egyptian, Chinese, Assyro-Babylonian, Jewish, Greek, Roman, Muslim, Slavic, and Romano-German. So somewhat West European orientation to that, or West Eurasia orientation to that definition of historical cultural types. And he argued that there was a kind of a teleological process of evolution, with each stage going through a youth, adulthood, and old age. The Slavic world was still young and could be unified at its capital at Constantinople. He saw progress as an illusion and history as circular. And the theory was praised by Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, but criticised by Westerners. But it also prefigured the ideas of Oswald Spengler with the decline of the West, and Arnold Toynbee, the study of history, and many of the big ideas about civilization that were articulated through the 20th century. And if you're interested in this, I've done an audio podcast around the concept of civilization and concepts of civilization. In fact, I've done a group of about 4 or 5 of these podcasts that looks closely at the work of Felipe Fernandez Amesto on civilization. So I'll include a link below and you might want to check it out. And of course, he also prefigures the work of Samuel Huntington in The Clash of Civilizations and the remaking of World Order in the 1990s, which, again, we'll come to in a moment. Okay, the 6th reference from Vladimir Putin is a little bit cryptic and maybe a bit speculative on my part, but I think probably valid as well. So Putin says at one point he's discussing Eurasia, and if you look back at my earlier video on the outline of his speech, you'll catch that. He's talking about Eurasia and the development of strong relationships across all the different Eurasian states and enabling them to develop in their own path. and compares this model of development that seems to be occurring with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and other initiatives, the One Belt, One Road initiative and others, to the sort of grand geopolitical strategies outlined in the West, which he describes as the simplistic ideas professed by Western masterminds. Now, I think this is a reference to none other than Zbigniew Brzezinski. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who wrote this book here, The Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and its Geostrategic Imperatives in the 1990s, 1998. I think it initially appeared as an essay in Foreign Affairs in 1996 or 97. And this is really, re-articulates the long sort of Anglo-American idea that Eurasia is like the world island, and he who controls the world island controls the world, and so that there needs to be a contest for the heartland of the Eurasian space, which in effect is Russia. And he really describes the world as a chessboard on which grand geostrategist Western masterminds play their games, and other countries are merely pawns in doing that. And of course, one of Brzezinski's big ideas was to weaken the Soviet Union by supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, to also support the weakening of Russia on its western flank through Poland and Ukraine. So I think that's probably the reference he's making there. And Brzezinski continues to be a major influence on American geostrategic thinking, but I think in this statement you can see Putin is also articulating some different ideas about geopolitics to those that are dominant in the West. Okay, our final seventh cultural reference in Putin's speech, and this really comes right at the end of the speech, where he refers to a symphony of civilizations. And here he refers to a dialogue between civilizations, recognizing the ultimate dignity and spiritual essence of people. Initially, I don't think I quite picked up this reference initially. It seemed like a nice phrase, Symphony of Civilizations. But as I thought about it, and as I prepared this work, looking at Solzhenitsyn's description of the arrogance of the West and the need to recognize other traditions, including the Orthodox Russian tradition, as I looked at Danilevsky's argument about different historical cultural types, and Zinoviev's arguments about the super society of Western society that was sort of gobbling up or alternative traditions, and Putin's caustic remarks about Zbigniew Brzezinski and his Grand Chessboard, it occurred to me that this reference to a symphony of civilizations is probably a subtle speechwriter's reference in contrast to Samuel Huntington's book, A Clash of Civilizations. I'd need to check the exact meaning of the Russian, but a symphony is a contrast to the discord of a clash, but whether the Russian words are more evidently related to each other, I'm not sure. But to me, this is very much a reference to Samuel Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations, and the remaking of world order. which was published in the mid-1990s and argued that the world was divided into kind of civilizational zones, which were largely defined in current geopolitical terms and in kind of religious terms. So the whole Russian ex-Soviet Union kind of space was defined as the Orthodox world. And as we see, Putin really challenges that. And there were a few other oddities. And even though Huntington described those different orders, he had a very, very strong preference for the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant liberal legacy of the United States, and he was really trying to articulate a way in which that civilization could remain dominant in the world. So what Vladimir Putin is really referring to here is that we need to perhaps be more genuinely pluralist in our thinking about civilizations and in order to embrace the opportunity of a multipolar world and genuinely respect all the traditions of the world. And if you want to do that, this is a great way to start doing it, reading Felipe Fernandez Amesto's book Civilizations, which is an absolute masterpiece and both describes the historiography of different concepts of civilizations over the centuries, as well as looking at all types of civilizations as a way of adapting life and culture to different natural ecological niches and environments. Absolutely brilliant show. And as I mentioned perhaps earlier on, I have done a series of podcasts on the Burning Archive podcast, which is available on Spotify and other platforms, Apple Podcasts, about this concept of civilizations articulated by Amesto, and actually look through the many types of civilizations that have been, and how, if you like, the world has always had this opportunity of listening to the symphony of civilizations in the world. So it's a surprising place to find oneself talking about Vladimir Putin, that killer, that dictator, but in a way Vladimir Putin's speech, far more than the speeches of many of the Western leaders at the moment, seems to be open and celebrating the true cultural, political, social, historical diversity of the world. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed this program and it's helped you understand this significant figure in the world a little bit better, as well as perhaps understand a little bit better some of the complex dynamics that seem to be at play in the current global conflict between NATO and Russia. I've done one more video which is related to the Q&A session with Vladimir Putin's speech, and I quickly run through all the amazing questions he got from all around the world in that show, just to give you a bit of a flavour of the breadth of it. So if you like that, do check it out, and like, subscribe, share this video around, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye now.